Hey, welcome to episode 3 of the Higgs Flicks podcast. So last week, me and my wife, we marathoned the first 10 Star Wars films in preparation for the Disney Plus release of The Rise of Skywalker. That's right, I refused to pay full price for that movie. After Last Jedi, I just didn't really care as much and was willing to wait until it came out on streaming, which was this past Monday on May the 4th. So now that I have finally seen every last theatrical live-action Star Wars film, I want to stop and rank all these films from the worst to the best. I got 11 of these films fresh in my mind, so I think this ranking is going to be pretty spot on. Coming in dead last is Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. This film has been the reigning champion as the biggest stinker in the Star Wars universe for the past 18 years. And still is, even after the sequel trilogy. This film takes everything that I dislike about Phantom Menace, but also takes away from the more fun elements of it. And what you get is a movie that is not only awkward, but boring. That's not to say this movie doesn't have its share of action scenes. You know, my favorite sound effect in the whole movie is that big that happens whenever Obi-Wan is chasing around Jango Fett. But everyone just seems to be going through the motions in this film. There's no sense of urgency. The biggest example of this is the whole thing where the film full-on stops in its tracks to focus on Anakin and Padme's romance. And yeah, everyone makes fun of the whole I don't like sand thing, and that's pretty awkward, but that's not the problem with it. 1, it goes on forever. 2, Padme hears all this, and later on him rambling about expressing serious psychopathic tendencies, and somehow still finds him charming enough to sleep with and even marry him. That scene isn't the only issue, but it really encapsulates the issue with the film as a whole. It's boring, awkward, and it has zero direction whatsoever. Coming in 10th place is the most recent Star Wars film, The Rise of Skywalker. Yeah, it's not the worst Star Wars film in the franchise, but it's pretty close. The biggest problem with the film is there's so many events that just come out of nowhere, from the resurrection of Palpatine, who is either the real deal, which in that case, it takes away from the idea that Anakin was the chosen one when he defeated Palpatine in Return of the Jedi, or he's a clone if you're a nervous Disney exec. Then you have the sudden ability to force heal, to the fact that Rey is apparently the granddaughter of Palpatine, to the fact that C-3PO, for some reason, can't translate some Sith writings because he was programmed to only translate good languages, and the fetch quest. There's so many fetch quests, it feels less like a Star Wars film and more like a Skyrim playthrough. There's this dagger that Rey has to find so that she can line it up correctly with the fallen Death Star that will help her find her the coordinate to the throne room of the newly resurrected Palpatine, and just nothing in this movie makes sense. It's just stuff happening. Now, some of that stuff is awesome. Rey exploding a spaceship with Force lightning, Kylo Ren kicking butt in the first 5 minutes, and the space battles are pretty cool to watch. It's just none of these events have any cohesion. I don't even know how to write a real synopsis for this film because it adds so many things at the last minute that it's basically impossible to follow. It's a cool light show, but it's not a great movie. Coming in 9th place is, funny enough, the beginning of the end for the sequel trilogy, Episode 8, The Last Jedi. This film takes everything that J.J. Abrams set up in The Force Awakens and takes a big, giant dump on everything that has come before. Luke Skywalker is no longer this legendary hero, but is instead a bitter old hermit who tries to kill his nephew on the off chance that he might turn evil. Poe Dameron is an insufferable hothead, and apparently Snoke is nobody, Rey's parents are nobody, and nothing in the past really matters at all, to the point that you may as well have never watched the previous films because they're apparently all bullcrap anyway. If you didn't like Episode 9, you can thank this film for throwing a wrench into not only the trilogy, but the saga as a whole. The only reason I put this as my 9th and not my 10th place is honestly because while I hate what this film does with the lore, at least the locations are fun to look at. Even that stupid casino scene, I will admit, is visually pleasing. Coming in 8th place is Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This movie was really the first big misstep in the Star Wars universe. It attempted to appeal to kids by having fart jokes and goofy characters like Jar Jar Binks, which alienated most audiences above the age of 6, but it also alienates little kids in this movie by having dialogue about trade federations, border negotiations, and international space taxes. So you get was a weird mess in which this film does a poor job at connecting with both kids and adults, making nobody happy. With that being said, this movie could be worse. Obviously, I think that since it's not dead last. There are times in which I do feel like rewatching Phantom Menace because despite its flaws, there are a lot of moments that I genuinely like. The costuming is phenomenal, the lightsaber fights are like giant ballets, and the music has possibly the best Star Wars track to this day, Duel of the Fates. Oh, and the ending battle scene is so spectacular. Yes, you have to sit through a lot of boring and clunky dialogue and some extremely dated CGI, but this film has a lot of things going for it to the point that it's overall a fairly enjoyable experience. Coming in 7th place is Solo, a Star Wars story. Now this ranking is tricky for me, because on one hand, there's nothing about this movie that really offends me, but on the other hand, there's nothing in it that really wowed me either. This really is the movie that made me realize Disney didn't really have a clear direction in which the Star Wars universe was going to go, like some of their other properties, like Marvel. The main reason this film seems like it has a clear lack of direction is because of a lack of a clear director. During the shooting of this film, which was held by 21 Jump Street's Phil Lord and Chris Miller, they had some creative differences behind the scenes, which led to Kathleen Kennedy firing Phil Lord and Chris Miller and replaced them with Apollo 13's Ron Howard. And this lack of direction really shows, as it feels like there are 5 movies happening all at the same time. At first, it's like a Fast and Furious type film, then it becomes a gangster movie, then a war film, then a heist film, and it never feels like there's a true cohesive narrative. It does a couple of cool things, I suppose. The inclusion of Darth Maul was cool, but you only see him for a couple of minutes and then he's gone. Donald Glover pulls off a really great performance as Lando, but he also apparently wants to have sex with his robot. And you get to see Han do the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs, but the action is so hard to make out that there's nothing really that memorable to look at. If you need something to bridge the gap between episodes 3 and 4, this'll do the job. But outside of a couple of fan moments, there's just not really anything to write home about. Coming in 6th place is another in-between type of movie, Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Now, this movie has a lot of cool stuff. The cast plays their roles phenomenally, the action feels like Saving Private Ryan in space, Darth Vader slaughters a horde of rebel soldiers like they were a classroom full of younglings. But the best scene by far about this movie is without a doubt that they fixed the most glaring plot in A New Hope. And that's the fact that there's this super convenient exhaust port that if you shoot a laser through it, the whole thing will explode. Which, great plot device, but doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this movie takes that idea and retcons it and makes it integral to the plot of Rogue One. Because they make it that it was actually a double agent who designed the Death Star with the express intention of hoping that it would be destroyed one day. Which, in my opinion, is a stroke of genius. It adds to the lore without contradicting it, like Rise of Skywalker or Last Jedi. With that being said, it's not enough to make this a great movie. For one thing, while the actors play their characters pretty well, the characters themselves are whittled down to their most basic traits to the point that they're just blind guy, or Forrest Whitaker with throat cancer, or jerk droid. Because of this, you don't care about their deaths, because there was nothing really about them to get attached to besides their most basic qualities. And of course, the CGI on the late Peter Cushing and Carrie Fisher were rough back in 2016 and just downright creepy in 2020. Coming in 5th place is Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Now, a little personal info about this. This movie came out when I was 10 and was the first Star Wars movie I ever saw, and what really made me fall in love with Star Wars. The fun action scene appealed to the kid part of me, but the tragedy of Anakin becoming Darth Vader appealed to the part of me that was starting to mature a little bit. And because this film struck a chord with me, anytime I would go to the store with my mom at the time, I would beg her to buy me anything Star Wars related. We didn't have that much money, so rather than buying me the whole box set, anytime I would go to Walmart with my mom, I would just have her, like, one by one, buy me another Star Wars film until I finally had all 6 films. And I probably ran through the campaign of Star Wars Battlefront 2 at least 3 times during the holiday season of 2005. Now, rose-colored glasses aside, how's the movie as an adult? Well, it's definitely the best in the prequel trilogy, but it's still got a lot of problems. The biggest thing I can think of is there are a lot of really great moments in this film, but are immediately undercut by something really dumb. The biggest culprit is the scene in which Mace Windu is about to take down Palpatine. He's got Palpatine on the ropes, and then Palpatine blasts him with the Force Lightning, which blew my 10-year-old mind. And then Anakin still decides to side with Palpatine despite him clearly being the bad guy. And another is the final scene in which Anakin dons the mask of Darth Vader, and you get to see what the inside of the mask looks like, and the whole scene is really chilling, especially when you hear that first little But then, is immediately undercut by Darth Vader, coolest villain in film history, yelling, This film has a lot of cool ideas and a lot of scenes that really do work. It's just they clash with some of the dumber aspects of this movie. Coming in fourth place is Star Wars The Force Awakens. Because of how the sequel trilogy went totally off the rails, it's easy to forget how much fun Episode 7 really is. This movie gets a bit of a bad rep for being too derivative of New Hope, but I can't really say I blame Disney for giving us what we got. For one thing, this came out during a time when people were furious with George Lucas for straying too far away from the tone of the original trilogy, to the point that for a while, George Lucas was the laughingstock of Star Wars. So Disney felt forced to let fans know right out of the gate that they were going to make a Star Wars film that felt like the Star Wars that they remembered so fondly. So because of this, you get a protagonist stuck on a desert island, a villain with its potential to turn good, and the funky saloon with wacky space creatures. With that being said, to say that this is just a direct copy of A New Hope is a little too oversimplified. For one thing, you have a stormtrooper who decides he doesn't want to be evil, a Han Solo who believes that the Force is real because of all the stuff that he went through in the original trilogy, and this movie offers some of the best looking special effects in the entire saga. My favorite scene is at the very end, where Rey and Kylo are fighting on that snow planet, and the light from the lightsabers actually reflect off other objects, making it so it actually feels like the lightsabers are there and not just something that they added in post. Plus, I love that shot where Kylo is about to finish off Finn, and the lightsaber zips past Kylo's face and reveals that Rey was actually the one who force-pulled it off screen. Does it feel like the film plays the hits a lot? Yeah, but sometimes I like a good greatest hits album. Now we're in the top 3, and if you hadn't noticed, the only films I haven't covered are the ones from the original trilogy. These films are the foundation upon which this franchise stands, and to this day still have yet to be topped, and probably never will be. So, let's start off with third place, Return of the Jedi. Definitely the weakest of the Holy Trilogy, but also still pretty good. The biggest problems that I have with this film are only really a couple things, but the flaws are pretty glaring. The biggest problems that I have with this movie are actually right at the very beginning. This film has a sort of cold opening in which Luke has to formulate a rescue mission after Han was frozen in carbonite back in Episode 5, and this rescue mission takes a grand total of 35 minutes to complete. And outside of the inclusion of Han Solo, it's so detached from the rest of the film that the film itself truly doesn't start until Luke goes to visit Yoda around the 40-minute mark. Aside from how long this scene takes, there's also the issue of what goes on in this half-hour opening. This scene probably has the moment that gives me the most secondhand embarrassment, far worse than Jar Jar Binks or Anakin talking about sand. Jedi rocks. For the record, this is something that is part of the special edition, not the theatrical cut, but since you can't buy the original version outside of the black market, this is technically canon. This opening goes from convoluted heist to awkward music video, and the character designs are just so horrendous. To this day, I can still see that one alien's uvula. So anytime as a kid I put Return of the Jedi on, I would just have to look away because even at 11 years old, I knew that this scene was dumb. The good thing is it's over pretty quickly, and you get this really awesome sequence in which Luke has to fight off this giant monster before getting eaten alive, and it's pretty creative for what it is. The other major flaw with this movie is the Ewoks. Now I'm not one of those people that hate the Ewoks. They're enjoyable in small doses, but you don't get them in small doses. The film's climax cuts back to them time and time again, interrupting the best sequence of the whole trilogy, which is the final confrontation between Luke, Vader, and Palpatine. You got a really cool scene with a lot of suspense, and you get to see some shenanigans with Care Bears from space. It just doesn't mesh well. Really, if not for the Ewoks and the opening at Jabba's palace, this would probably be my number one, as I think it has the most cathartic ending in the whole saga. Anakin fulfills his prophecy as the Chosen One by killing off Palpatine, despite what Rise of Skywalker would have you believe. And he gets to see his son Luke with his own eyes just one last time before he dies. And it also has my favorite thing that the special edition has that the theatrical version don't. You get to see an entire galaxy celebrating the end of the Empire and not just a handful of Ewoks having a party. Coming in second place is The Empire Strikes Back. You really couldn't ask for a more perfect film. For one thing, the film jumps right into the action with Luke scavenging the ice planet of Hoth, only to immediately get attacked by his giant snow creature. The training with Yoda has my favorite quote of the whole saga.
Do or do not. There is no try.
And while it is such pop culture knowledge nowadays, Darth Vader revealing himself as Luke's father is such a chilling scene, and the pain in Luke's face in this moment is heartbreaking. There's literally nothing wrong with this film. And you might be asking why it isn't my number one if I think it's a perfect film. Well, to be honest, as perfect as it is, the dark and suspenseful nature isn't that much fun for me. Don't get me wrong, it's still a masterpiece of filmmaking, but given the choice of what I would rather sit down and rewatch for sheer entertainment value, I will always go back to the one that started it all, Star Wars, aka Episode 4, A New Hope. George Lucas seriously hit the ground running with his Star Wars debut feature, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that while yes, George Lucas has so much creative control since this is his first Star Wars film, but because this was his first, there were so many people telling him no, especially all the edits that Carrie Fisher did. While it's not a perfect film, it gets so many things right, particularly the hero's journey with Luke Skywalker. He's just a farm boy who wants more in life, and this is exemplified in that binary sunset scene in which he looks over the horizon and John Williams' orchestra swells in the background. Then, when his aunt and uncle are killed, he chooses to embark on a quest that'll change his life forever, in which he must learn to trust in something bigger than himself and be everything that he was destined to be. This movie is so simple and in the best way possible. Not only that, but this movie is so well paced. Not once does it ever feel like we're in the same location for too long. The best scene is when Han and Luke go to rescue Princess Leia, and they go to so many different points, where they find themselves in a detention area and a trash compactor, for goodness sake. And the sequence as a whole combines action, humor, and a slight dash of 70s cheese. I think my favorite line in the whole movie is when Han talks to the Empire guy over the intercom, and he's just like, everything is fine, situation normal, how are you? And he just shrugs his shoulders. Like, I don't know, best I could do. But the joke is also done away fairly quickly. If this were done today, looking at you, Poe and Finn, you would have had Han basically doing a full-on Jerry Seinfeld bit, not willing to let the joke die. This movie knows how to be funny and poke fun of itself, but also respects the viewer's intelligence enough to move on to something else. And that final dogfight where the rebels take down the Death Star is so well done and pulls on the tension throughout the whole fight and doesn't let go until the very end, right when Han Solo Hail Marys it at the last second, which allows Luke to blow up the Death Star in one of the most satisfying ever put to film. While this movie has its share of flaws, the costuming isn't that great, and the lightsaber between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader is kinda lame, and some of the special effects haven't aged too well. But this movie's so many things right that you're willing to look past the flaws and just get sucked into this wild tour de force from beginning to end. Like, it's the movie that started it all, and it's the film that set the standard for what space films should be from that moment forward. And that's my ranking of all 11 Star Wars films. Do you have a different ranking? Let me know in the comments and explain why. I'd love to have a lively discussion with you all. But anyway, that concludes this podcast. I'm Higgs, this has been my flick, and thanks for listening.